Check it out. We've got an LSD for the EB60 transmission. So today we're going to talk about what it takes to install this guy, and we're also going to install the reverse detent, essentially what you need to do, and optionally this, to put the transmission in the MR2 Spyder, whether you're doing a 2GR or a 2AR. All right, yeah, so the LSD. Well, if you're watching this on the day it was released, or probably a couple months after, this won't be available for sale yet, but my intention is to make it actually available. It's a helical type limited slip differential for the EB transmission. Lots of people have been asking for this, and apparently this has been a holdback on going with the rest of my kit parts. So hopefully this will be available soon. Today is actually going to be just the first test fitment. This is kind of that prototype unit. We're also going to cover how to install the reverse detent. Now, this part is not really optional for the Spyder swap. This part is. So I will make sure to note, if you're not doing this, where you can stop and kind of ignore the instructions, and then where you can restart for the sake of this, because we're just going to have to go just a little bit deeper to replace this guy. What you see on the table back here is basically a disassembled transmission. The previous transmission that I disassembled in the other video, it is more of a core. On the shim, you won't be able to see it, but essentially this bearing here, this is the back of the input shaft. You see how it's black? This should have been, I forget if it's green or blue, but not black. And that means that this guy has been replaced. And the shim is actually showing signs that the outer race spun. Whoever reassembled the transmission didn't care. They just simply replaced the bearing, and they didn't do anything else in the transmission. So I have to fully disassemble it, and it's just going to take some time. And frankly, while I do want to make a video on it, and I am recording that, I don't think that's the video we need right now, because most of you guys are not going to be dealing with trying to restore a core transmission. So yeah, so today what we're going to do instead, we're going to take a different transmission that I've got. Actually, we're going to use an EB62, which is out of the Camry. Nothing specific about it. We're only using an EB62 because that's what I've got. Both are interchangeable. The only difference is if you've got an EB62, these two levers here, so these are the shift levers, you have to use the EB60 shift levers for the rest of the shift kit to work. These don't cost a whole lot, and the part number is right here. First step is just to remove the hydraulic stuff attached to the outside of the transmission. Next, there's a reverse idler fastener right here. Take that out. Next, on the shift lever here, and keep in mind, yours will look like this. I remove the weights for racing. With the weights on there, it gives a better shift feel, but it does slow down the shift a little bit. So that's your decision to make. So on this, there's a clip right here. Remove the clip, and then you push it in. You won't be able to pull the transmission apart unless you do that. Next, we got to get the detent balls out. This is the cross gate, and this is the gate detent. Okay, to get the slave out. There's just 3 bolts holding this in. The reverse sensor. Then we got a few more detents. You see one here, and there's a few more. Another one here, and another one here. Don't forget the balls in the bottom there. All right, so then you can't quite see them all in shot, but there's a whole perimeter of bolts. Go all the way around and just take those off. All right, and then to split the case, there's tabs here and there sticking out. And then should just be a question of lifting it right up. And there it is. All right, so what's interesting about this transmission is I haven't been in this transmission probably about 10,000 race miles. Interestingly, it also still has the green bearing here, and this is the original one from this transmission. So, and this transmission's got about a total of about 35,000 race miles on it. So, yeah, let me bring you back up to the top. So I'm really curious while we're in here. So that's really interesting. I'm not sure if you can see that. Let's see if we can catch it kind of in that reflection there. So this bearing appears to be in good shape, but despite that, it still has been spinning. Huh, that might need to be, I don't know. You might need to do something to stop that rotation. I can just barely kind of feel it with my fingernail, which means it's probably only about 0.02 of an inch or so. All right, we're just going to continue taking things apart. The reverse idler comes out with the reverse gear. Oh, I'm sorry, I really forgot to mention. The stuff that we just took off here, you don't need to take that off if you're not replacing the differential. If you're replacing just that reverse detent, what you need to do now that you're at this point is just, well, first we have to be in neutral. You turn this all the way over, and then you pull it out. There you go. So the rest of this, until we're back to this point right here, is only if you're replacing the differential. So this will kind of slide right out. And now all the rest kind of has to come out together. And yes, it's fun to put it back in, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. And there it is. And there it is. So we'll take the shafts, we'll set them aside for now. All right, and this is the piece we're going to be replacing. Now, just to show you guys, if you remember from last video, see, these Spyder gears they're supposed to move freely. Like there's resistance there from the oil, kind of that stickiness of the oil, but there's no actual effort required. So that part's going to leave, and then what we're going to need, we're going to take all these bolts off. We're going to get 2 of these bearings because you can't salvage these. So you see the part number right there, 90366-57028. And let's put them on the limited slip. So first we put the ring gear on. And now we torque this. I'm trying to figure out how to best hold this. Yeah, actually that'll work. Yeah. It'll probably slip out a couple times, but all right, we're going to start at 50. Then another round at 70 foot-pounds. And then one last step to 85. All right, and now the bearings have been pressed on. So now what we need to do is we need to verify the preload, because we're potentially changing the thickness of the differential. You know, it might vary by a couple thousandths. We need to make sure that it's got the right shim. So we're going to get the case, and we're actually going to get the case for the original transmission, since that one's been modified for the 2GR. And the transmission I just took apart a second ago, I want to put back behind a 2AR eventually. So we're going to kind of mix and match. So you want to remove the old race. And then on this side, so I've also removed the seal. You don't have to remove the seal, but if you do, it's easier to not put it in until the end. So, a little plastic splash guard, I think. Now we don't put any of the other things in here. We just put the differential. A little bit of transmission oil on the race. Let's get the other side ready. And on this one, we're going to hope we're lucky. I mean, you got to start somewhere. So put the old shim in, and then we're going to tap the bearing in. A little transmission lube. And now we bolt the 2 halves together. All right, so next what we need is an inch-pound dial torque wrench and the instructions. We need a special service tool to engage the splines. The part number is, well, it's right on the screen right here. And we're shooting for, it's a new bearing, so 13 to 20 inch-pounds. Now, for me, this is the same spline as the second gen, so I've got these stubs laying around. As long as you don't have the seal here, that'll work just fine. And you got to be at about a 90-degree angle to this so that you don't get any extra error. So let's see where we're at. Okay, so it looks like it was 30 most of the way. Sometimes these take a little bit to seat, so, you know, give it a few rotations and then try again. Yeah, so it's 30 inch-pounds. So there's too much preload on this, which means this differential is probably 5/10,000ths or maybe even 1,000th of an inch thicker than the previous one. So we got to get the shim out, put a smaller shim in. So let's do that. All right, and right off the Toyota parts counter, we've got one shim thinner. No, you don't need one of these. You can just buy a thinner shim. But since I have one of these, why would I spend $12 on a shim? Plus, I don't have to wait for this. I just go over to the next room. Let's go try it out. There you go. That was 15 to 20, give or take, which, for new bearings, that's right in our range. Range is 13 to 20, so. And yes, being out here does technically make a small difference because it's the distance between the pivot and where it's being measured versus this, but at a 90-degree angle, it's close enough. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. So I was getting the shafts back to the point where we can pick back up the video, and there's a perfect example here as to why I started doing all this stuff in the first place. So do you see these gears here? This is 5th gear, you know, 4th gear. They're all meshed pretty nicely. Look at 6th. So I had a transmission shop rebuild this thing. I've owned this transmission. The transmission of these gears came out of this case here is relatively new, but since 2009. And one of the times I did have to actually have it rebuilt by a shop because I just didn't have a garage space to work on, and I wanted the thing rebuilt. So I had them put in a new 3rd and 4th gear synchro. But and I think I had them replace bearings if they needed to be replaced. So obviously the good news is they did replace the bearing. The bad news is they put the damn gear on backwards. So, yeah, this is why I have trust issues, guys. All right, well, let's fix it. So the big lesson to take away here is, professional or not, a lot of these shops are in a hurry, and whether or not they can do things properly doesn't matter if they don't take the time to do it properly. So, oftentimes, an amateur can do a better job than a professional if they simply give a damn. So just, you know, be careful and try to figure out, try to pay attention when you're putting things together. That I totally understand putting that together in the wrong order, but you should have noticed it when you put the gear stack together, and you should have given a damn and been able to actually fix it. Now, thankfully, this transmission up until now has spent most of its time on the track, so I'm not sure it's seen 6th gear in the last, 35,000 miles for more than maybe 20 miles. So it doesn't really truly matter, but it's still wrong. The shop should have still fixed it. I bet they even noticed and they just didn't care. So here we are. sometimes I just have to learn that same lesson over and over and over and over. So there's good and bad news here. First of all, this is sixth gear. So some people talk about wanting taller highway gears. What I'm about to show right now, I'm going to be removing this gear and putting it back on the other way. But if this was an EB60 stack, what you'd want is the EB62 sixth gear. So what I'm showing you is exactly what you need to do. There's no clip or anything here. This shaft is just friction fit. And we're just going to push from here and push that whole thing off and then flip the gear around and put it all back on. Now, something important to note, if you look here on the bottom of the gears, it sticks out a little bit. There's some sharp little bits, but the gear was hardened after those sharp little bits were there. So when you're pressing against the bottom of the gear, make sure you have some aluminum here. Now this is about 90 thousandths aluminum. You don't need much. You just need something a little bit to kind of soften so those points can dig into something without just chipping off. So this is my setup right here. My press doesn't have a wide enough throat for the first gear to slip through. So I needed to come up with something, and this is just some 3/16 thick structural steel that I had laying around. Don't forget the little aluminum plates on the top to soften the teeth of that gear. And then don't forget to catch it so it doesn't get damaged. And there it is. Just need to flip it over and press it back on now. All right, and for reassembly, the bearing cage here stands proud of here. So I've just got a little washer there just to make it so I don't smash the bearing cage. Yeah, by the way, I make a point, whenever I press stuff apart, I keep the races. They end up being really nice, flat, parallel things that are various diameters to be able to press things together. Ends up being pretty handy. And there you go. This is just a Harbor Freight 20-ton press. Nothing modified to it. And the amount of work I just did right there would be what it would take to replace sixth gear. On the other shaft, there's a snap ring. And actually, let's talk about the other shaft. Let me go get it. So then the other half of replacing sixth gear, if you want to, is replacing this gear right here. And while we're in here, we might as well show you how to do it. The other thing you really want to check whenever you're inside this transmission is this bearing, the bearing on the rear of the input shaft. This often goes bad in this transmission. It's really the only known weak point for this transmission. So all you do for this one has a snap ring. We're going to take the snap ring off. See, snap ring. And then we're going to press from under here. And again, there's sharp little points here. So make sure you put the aluminum plate underneath there. But in my case, my bearing here is actually in good shape. I'm not going to replace it. So I'm not actually going to go through that step. But I will make a modification to this. We'll cover that in a little bit. All right, next you want to consider if there's any seals you want to replace on your transmission. You've got your cross gate selector shaft, which is your smallest one. You've got your gate selector shaft. And these two, I'm going to put a new one in because I took this transmission apart completely to clean it. But really, honestly, these two, I've never seen them go bad. The input seal, now that's the one that goes right here. While I have not seen that one fail, that one does see a lot of abuse, so it's definitely one to consider. And then both side output seals. Now these ones are honestly a pretty good idea to replace every time you're in the transmission. They do see the most abuse because the axle shafts do wobble a little bit, so you want to do those. And this one also is supposed to be set in just a tiny little bit. So find an appropriate size socket and some grease. All right, now comes the hardest part. See, if somebody else was putting the differential at the same time, that would have been easy. Oh, there we go. Oh, great. That went easier than I expected. Okay, we just have a few more steps to catch up to where people that didn't replace the LSD, replace the differential with an LSD. We have to put all the reverse stuff here. Okay, now we need to put the reverse idler, but the shift fork has to go in at the same time. Pointy end up. There you go. And the line here has to point towards this. That'll make some of the later steps a lot easier. And the reverse linkage, I guess. That slides onto 2 dowel pins. And I use Loctite on these bolts. I don't think it actually calls for it, but I'm just paranoid on stuff like that can get loose inside the transmission. I'll put this part back in. And by the way, if you're curious, all that kind of notchiness and where you're feeling the gates and whatnot, that's mostly from this part inside the transmission. Theoretically, you can adjust this if you wanted a slightly different feel, but that's a pretty advanced thing. And frankly, I like the feel of this transmission. There you go. You want that about centered over that hole down there. And now all the people that weren't installing an LSD can go ahead and rejoin us. If you remember, we had just pulled this shaft out, and it's time to install this. So this needs to go in place of this, and the difference is just this extra little dip right there that isn't here. That's going to give you, when you're between first and second and reverse, normally there's no detent. That's on the shifter that's inside the cabin, inside the Camry as well as the TC. So you need to do something with it, and I decided to add it there. So this is pretty easy. We just got to pull one of these sides off and then the middle, and then put this in its place. Gonna slip that off and put it on in the same direction. Actually, it's going to be easier if we start the pins on the bench. All right, and note, the new part you're putting on there does have a tiny bit of play. I would have loved to make it, just as tight as this one, but the truth is, it doesn't actually matter. That doesn't affect the functionality, and I also don't have access to what the tolerance on this shaft is, so I didn't want to make it to where they didn't fit. So, just wobbled a little bit. It's not a big deal. And then, with this in the slot right there, we just kind of have to turn this over a little bit and slide it right back in. And it'll take some jiggling and a little bit of grease in there. Can make things a little bit easier. Oh, the roll pin has to be below the surface, otherwise it's not going to fit in there. There we go. Now, let's go ahead and talk about this input bearing. So, the issue with this thing here is this is supposed to be greased for, well, actually, well, for life, right? Because there's no way, there's a seal on the other side also. There's no way for anything to get in or out of there. But if you pull this off of a transmission that's got some miles, you'll see it's filled with oil. If you pull it off of a new bearing, you'll see that it's got grease. So that means the grease is leaving and is getting replaced with oil. But because it's got seals on it, that oil doesn't change over very quickly. Essentially, it's just thermal cycles of the transmission, right? So everything gets good and hot, it burps out a little bit of air or a little bit of grease or a little bit of oil, and then when it cools back down, it'll suck it right back into the seals a little bit, because this thing gets good and hot. So what we're going to do, let's take a look at the other half of the case. So you can see in here, where this goes, there's this guide right here, and the reason there's this guide is because that's sending oil through the shaft, which is oiling 6, 5, 4, and 3. There's a little hole in there that allows the oil to get in there into the needle bearings that are in there, which is great, and that's telling us that oil is getting back there, right? It just gets up here and drips down to the bottom, comes in here and does that. So if that oil is there, then that means it's right here. If we could just get it, if we could just get that oil into that bearing. Now, here it's really close to it, so it's not going to go in on that side, but my thought is, let's just rip that seal off. And then that becomes an oiled bearing, which is no different than this one, which is at the other end of the input shaft. There's nothing wrong with it. Let's take a look. Now, keep in mind, I haven't opened this yet. Well, I mean, you would know if I had. This bearing has about 35,000 miles of race on it. It has never been replaced. I bet it's full of oil. So, sure enough, there's no grease in there to be found. You know what? There is a little bit. There's a little bit of dust and dirt in there. Not much at all. There's no, I can't feel any play. Oh, you know what? I can see play. Okay. Oh. Really? Really? That's all gonna come back apart? Ah. All right, well, it's the right thing to do. The seal must have been stopping the movement, so this bearing, just barely, but it has begun to fail. So what we're going to do, we're going to replace it. Which means all that has to come back apart. All right, time lapse. let's just collectively pretend that that never happened now, shall we? So let's look at our problem a little more closely. So now we've replaced this. So this bearing is nice and tight, but what's going on is essentially any kind of grit here, and you know, slowly over time a bearing will wear a little bit, but it's just sitting in there and it's spinning, and it's regrinding it over and over and over, making this a very dirty area. So what we need to do is we need to get lubrication to flow through this thing. Now, flowing out through the other side is not really a good option. You know, first of all, because I've reassembled it. But if I just take the seal off the other side, then I'm afraid we won't get enough lube through here. And then the 3, 4, 5, 6 needle bearings just won't get enough lubrication. So whatever I do, it needs to not be a whole lot. But then again, this right here, right, this is the abuse after 30,000 miles of racetrack use. This was a whole bunch of miles above the factory red line. So I think this is a problem. This is definitely a problem, but I don't think it's something that needs a drastic change, just a small change. So if I do this, my question there is it really going to recirculate? Is the swarf that's generated in here, you know, very little, but over time, is that going to make it out to the magnet, or is it just still going to stay in here, just a slightly bigger pocket now that I've given it this extra space here? In theory, it could escape through here, and once it makes it through here, then unfortunately it'll go through the needle bearings, but the swarf here should be really minuscule stuff, and there shouldn't be a lot of it. Or do I make a modification to the case to allow it to escape a little bit? Here's what I think I'm going to do. I'm going to take this right here. I'm going to drill a little hole right at the bottom so that at least sees more oil. Now that still doesn't give it a way to escape, but okay. So this still doesn't give a way for the oil to escape out of the bearing. It's any of it that makes it in there is going to have to leave through the center here. But I think that's what I'm going to do for the first attempt. So now it's time to close it back up. The only thing is, we're going to have to flip this upside down. It's going to want to come out. Just a little bit of grease. Just a little bit of grease on here will make it so that it just holds while we have it upside down. So just give everything a final look. Don't forget to put your magnet back, and then we're going to add the sealant and close it up. And before you put any screws down the case, you want to try this one first, the one for the reverse idler, because if this doesn't go in, you might have to pull it back apart. And sometimes this helps to turn it a little bit as you're going, as you're pushing. Once you get that one in, you actually want to loosen it just a tiny little bit and then put all the case screws in. Now, we pull this out. And put the clip in. Now you take the reverse screw back out. This one's a potential leak path, so you want to put just a little bit of RTV. I'm actually going to go clean this first. Just a little bit of RTV around the base. And again, same 22 foot-pounds. Click. All right, now we need to get the detent balls. That one is one of these, the captured ball bearing. It's spring and one of the bigger caps. This one, which is the same type. Okay, and then we got this one, and this one. Those are the smaller, just the regular balls. And now we can test that it shifts through all the gears. So this is the gate selector, and this is the cross gate selector. So this is reverse. And now we got the 3 holes we got to plug. So we got the one right here, which is actually just an access hole, but I end up using this as a fill hole a lot. Then the fill hole in the back, or actually the front of the transmission. And then the drain hole underneath the differential. All right, now we need the seals. And since I'm going to be fabricating around this transmission before it's finished installed, I'm going to put these caps in also. And it also gets a seal. Yeah. We got ourselves a transmission for the Widowmaker. Yeah, well, I'm pretty happy about that. We ended up with slightly different gearing than I was expecting because we ended up using the input and the output shaft from the EB62, which is the one out of the Camry instead of the TC. Then that means that 4th, 5th, and 6th gear are all a little bit taller. Which one is better is, honestly, depends on what you're doing with it. For track use, especially the kind of speeds where we're doing in lemons, I find that the EB60's gearing, so the one in the TC, is better because 4th gear is about like 4-5% lower, and we don't run out. We basically get to the red line almost in 4th gear now instead of going over. So that gives us, 4 or 5% more torque to the ground, which is advantageous. This one here, the EB62, the 6th gear is a little bit taller than on the other one, but on the EB62, the 5th and 6th gear are really close to each other. I think the RPMs drop like 300 RPMs at highway speeds. There's really almost no difference between 5th and 6th. I think the gearing is really that way because of fuel economy requirements for the Camry when they put it in there. So if you're looking for something that's got, the absolute best fuel economy you can on the highway, but you're looking for a fun toy with better gearing, perhaps the best option is actually to use the EB60 and then just buy the EB62's 6th gears and swap those in. Now, that ends up making for a bit of an expensive transmission. The truth is, whichever one you get is good enough. And just keep in mind, if you start with an EB62, this lever and the other lever, they are different on the 60, so you will have to change them to the ones on the 60. So these are pretty cheap from the dealer. I want to say like 55 or 60 bucks for the pair of them total. So yeah. I think the next thing we're going to do is the way these projects go, you kind of want to knock out the hard things first. So I think the next hardest thing is going to be the front exhaust. Actually, hard by quite a distance. I will go ahead and button up. I'm going to add my clutch and flywheel and all that stuff and bolt this to the motor on the next video, because I don't think they're going to have to come back apart. So I'll get those all buttoned up, and then we'll start working on the exhaust. So, oh, and remember, if you want to be notified about any of these parts becoming available, there's a link in the description that takes you to my site where you can sign up for mailing lists. I can't explain how much I hate spam, so I promise, absolutely promise, I will not send you any spam whatsoever. I will only send you what you sign up for specifically. So, yeah. Anyways, have a great day. We'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye. And as you can see, we've got a new bench surface here. It's high-density polyethylene, essentially a giant cutting board. I'm hoping that it provides contrast. I'm sure it'll get scratched up and everything, but the idea is that, you know, a little bit of brake clean on this. I don't know if there was any left in the can. Is it... Oh, that's going to screw with the focus.